Good morning, everyone. Actually, good afternoon if you're in Europe, I suppose.
Hello, everyone. We are live, as we like to say at the beginning of all our lives. So we have the pleasure today to have with us Mr. Parag Khanna. And for the few of you that probably don't know who he is, he's a leading global strategist and a best-selling author. This is his latest book. That the Italian title is Il Movimento del Mondo, which we will about the topics of this book we will talk about in a couple of minutes. He's the founder of FutureMap, and he provided expertise to governments all around the world, such as US, Canada, Germany, and so on. So we are really interested about talking with him, since this podcast it's made from Italian people. It's made by Italian people that are spread around the world. Actually, in this moment, I'm in Italy, but Giacomo is in Brussels, MP it's in the UK. And so we're really interested about the topic of this latest book, which the English title instead is Move, because it talks about migrations in the 21st century. And actually, I want to start with a nice case study that was present in this book. That's Italy, because as probably many of you know, Italy it's a country with a decreasing demography, with a huge problem of brain drain, and these are among the issues that Parag recognized in his book. And so, in your opinion, Mr. Khan, what do you think are the policies, or in general the things that Italy should put in place in order to reverse some of these trends and become a place that actually attracts talents?
It's a great question, and yes, Italy does come up, quite a few times in the book when I'm talking about the plateau, even the decline of the population globally, but especially in some countries where it's more advanced than others, like Japan and Italy and elsewhere, and also how that relates to political populism and the kind of plateau of the economies, which has an impact on the brain drain that you mentioned as well. And then population policies and whether or not those would be sufficient absent immigration to actually replenish and increase the national population. And the answer to all of those questions in the case of Italy is that things are not going in the right direction. Your populist politicians are not the first generation that's realized that there's a demographic issue, and their prescriptions for it are no better than any that have come before. So as far as I'm concerned, Matteo Salvini and his ilk are way too late to the game. And if anything, one of the things that I point out is that their vision is practically regressive. And what I tracked in the data is that more women are leaving Italy now than a few years ago, precisely because of his vision of what a wholesome, replenished, Italian family looks like, in which the woman, the mother stays at home and raises lots of children and doesn't really have a professional future. So Italian women are more likely to run from that scenario than to subscribe to it. So that's why I focus very much on, first of all, governance, making a country attractive to people from wherever they may be from. And that is going to have some organic effect potentially on fertility, but still not enough. And then I focus on migration. And I look at the different communities that have come to Italy, that are coming, that could come, and the geographies within Italy, particularly northern Italy, that has quite a different attitude in my experience and in my research than the rest of Italy when it comes to the role of migrants and the utility of migrants and being welcoming towards migrants and integrating them in a pragmatic way. So I'm not a migration utopianist, but I'm a pragmatist, and I would like to see Italy have a more pragmatic attitude towards migration.
Can I actually just take a little step back, just to try to understand where does these, how did you develop basically this expertise on migration, and how did you develop the theories that you have then explained and discussed in your recent book? So we were researching a little bit, and we found very fascinating your CV, basically your what you've done in life, and I want to understand, where does your interest for geopolitics come from? As the fact that you lived in India, UAE, US had an impact on how you see the world, on how you develop these theories, or is there more, basically?
Oh, for sure. I think from the very outset that I started writing in my early 20s, I always, felt that I should balance the academic training that I was fortunate to have with the travel that I've been fortunate to do. And I think that in my case, the inspiration was very simple. It was the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I was 12 years old and I was living in New York and my parents took me to Berlin. So, I think that I was a geopolitical junkie from the time that I was 12 years old, and I've never really looked back. So for the past 30 years, I've had a fairly singular obsession, and I credit the fall of the Berlin Wall in some ways with that, and the good fortune to have parents who not only have taken me traveling my whole life, I still go and travel and take trips with my parents even today, and as a multi-generational family. So that would be the single most important thing. Theory development, I would say, is more theory modification, right? I mean, because the academic training in certain fields and disciplines, political theory, political philosophy, international relations, geopolitics, always trying to fuse those together, but try to apply them to the real world as you see it. I think theoretical innovation is difficult unless you actually go out and see and have it meet the test of reality. So in my earlier books, that were about global governance and geopolitics and imperial competition, it always occurred to me that academics are always talking past each other in their theories, and they don't spend enough time looking at whether or not their theories are even remotely valid in the real world. Or maybe each of them is just partially valid, and you have to synthesize the best parts of them to get an accurate picture of the world. So in a nutshell, that's my methodology, right? Is theory plus travel. And, so that's how I got to this phase. When it comes to this book, by the way, it's not really just about migration. It's actually much deeper than migration. It's a book about human geography. I consider myself most interested in geography above all else. And I feel that so much derives from geography and people forget that. So I actually wanted to go back to human geography, which is our distribution across the world and how it came to be what it is. And migration, in terms of annual volumes of people or the directions in which people go, is one subset of a much bigger question of human geography, which relates to natural resources and the environment and climate change and ethnography and evolution. So many, human geography is much bigger than migration. So, obviously migration is a hot button issue and we can talk about migration all day long. But I believe that, fundamentally the problem about migration conversations is that they are so political because they are so focused on the here and now. But if you take a big step back and say, let's talk about human geography and the evolution of our footprint on the world, suddenly that's a epochal conversation rather than a Matteo Salvini kind of conversation, right? And therefore, you can actually be less political and find a common ground about what is the optimal distribution of humankind in the world. And that's the actual objective of the book, is to find an optimal distribution, a dynamic distribution of the human population, 8-9 billion people on 150 million square meters of soil on the planet. That's actually what the book is about.
And I think actually, what I think is really interesting about what you just said is that immigration is actually so political, which I completely agree with. And I think if you can look at geography instead, it does completely change the conversation. But speaking of sort of all of this data that you collected in relation to how you see migration of peoples and thinking about how they connect nowadays, I came across, whilst I was doing a bit of research for this, for today, I came across, and again, courtesy of Wikipedia, I don't know whether everything on there is also particularly accurate, but I read that you had co-authored a report that was called Alternative Worlds. I hope that's correct.
Alternative Worlds was the 2030 Global Trends Report of
exactly.
the National Council. I was a consultant to that process, but that is a very vast document that had many authors, and I was not a principal author of it, but I was very, very fortunate to be a part of it and to review the drafts and to contribute to the content.
Yeah, I found it fascinating just because I'm a sci-fi geek. So looking at sort of where the world is going in the next 20 years, I thought was really interesting. But there was a section I wanted to ask you about, and it's not specific at all, but it was just something that I thought was interesting, and it would be fun to sort of get your take on this, because there was a section that was talking about potential black swans, and it gave a couple of different scenarios, and I'd be interested to hear from you which scenario you now in 2021 think could actually be the most likely. So it was basically saying that one option could be a severe pandemic, which I thought was ironic because obviously the report was written in 2014 and they foresaw what happened now. Another one was an EU collapse. Another one was a collapsed China. Another one was a reformed Iran. One was nuclear war. One was solar storms, and so causing obviously, national electric grid catastrophes. And one was US disengagement. So out of all of these, obviously also based on all of your data, your studies, where do you think we could be heading?
Many of those specific scenarios were kind of parceled into much broader scenario kind of sketches of the world. So for example, one of the ones that I was most interested in at the time was called non-state world. And it was the idea that private actors would continue to gain in power. There would be more entropy and fragmentation in the system. The world would not only be multipolar, but also multi-actor. It would be neo-medievalism. And that's around the time I started to get obsessed with this idea that the world is kind of entering a new Middle Ages. And I continuously write about that. New Middle Ages is also the title of one of the scenarios in this Move book as well. So that episode really inspired my thinking. I would never have subscribed to a collapse of China or collapse of Europe scenario. I don't believe in those. One of the other key insights when you mentioned the United States was not so much US withdrawal, but the idea of US volatility. And that was a particularly important insight of that report, because it was the first time that the United States National Intelligence Council did not hold the United States itself as a constant and simply evaluate the trends and the chaos and the disruptions and the scenarios for the rest of the world, pursuing that the United States remains the unipolar anchor, stable, committed, leading alliances, and so forth for the planet Earth. This was the first of those reports that said, wait a minute, what if the US itself becomes a variable because of populism, protectionism, inequality, and a geopolitical competition and so forth. So on that point, of course, the report was spot on.
So moving on, there's a really interesting word you actually came up with, which is even the title of one of your books, which is Connectography. And connectography, it's a bit a mixture between connectivity and geography as we know it. And there is this really interesting TED talk that you gave 4 or 5 years ago, and I actually recommend everyone that's listening to this podcast to go and see it as soon as you can, in which you explain how we shouldn't see anymore, geography defined with the borders we are used to, but with the connection between, global cities and that sort of new players that are rising at the global stage. But do you believe there are still places in which instead geography has a role to play? Where people, since they are born there, they are actually they're dealt with a set of cards which isn't as empowering as other places. And how can this play a role in the future, and how can this change?
Sure. So remember that I'm always defending the role of geography. What I'm critiquing is the emphasis on political geography. So the question you're asking is really, where is it legitimate for political geography to supersede the other kinds of geography? So there are 4 kinds of geography, right? There's environmental, natural geography. There is political geography, borders and states. There is functional geography, which is infrastructure, supply chains, connectivity, so forth and so forth. And then there's human geography, us, right? So the goal is always to reconcile these 4 kinds of geography. So when you're asking about the future political geography has a very dynamic and active future as it always has for thousands of years. In fact, we have more states today than we've ever had in human history. We have 200 discrete, distinct, mutually recognized sovereign states. In fact, I'm an advocate of more state creation. I am a Wilsonian to my deepest core, to the bone, to every, to the depths, to every bone in my body is a Wilsonian bone. I'm a supporter of Kurds, of Palestinians, of every self-determinist and secessionist movement in the world. I believe every tribe should have a state if they want it. So in that sense, and you can see the maps from that book actually spell out and actually show physically the remaining non-consummated secessionist movements in the world for every region of the world. So I'm a believer in political geography. I'm not in denial of political geography. To the contrary. The question is, my vision is a world where actually, if every political unit is so small because every tribe has a state, then none can be autarkic, none can be self-sufficient, right? And therefore, they have no choice but to connect more with each other in order to distribute and share resources, right? And that's the evolutionary phase or process that I'm describing in that book. So the question is, where will political geography matter more or less? Well, it matters more in places that still have outstanding hostile border disputes, right? It matters more in Taiwan than it does in, say, Belgium, right? And the fact is, it's a very differentiated landscape. But again, in the evolutionary process, most regions of the world are making progress towards superseding and transcending their political geography through functional geography. Even in Africa, they've announced that they want to have a borderless African, Pan-African free mobility of people and a Pan-African free trade area by the year 2025. So Africa becomes effectively borderless, right? If you just layer in a common currency or cryptocurrency, you really have one African landmass. So, and Europe is, of course, the furthest along. So every part of the world goes through this evolution. It's almost teleological, and that's the way I describe it in the book. Again, borders never actually go away. It's just to what degree have you transcended them or not transcended them, right? That there is no transcendence on the border between India and China, right? But obviously there is between most European countries.
And that is quite interesting, actually, because I was just about to say that I think we tend to speak always in terms of continents and in terms of nations. And so this intervention actually is quite precise in this context. And I want to understand, do you believe that like a map of city-states or mega city clusters would be a more accurate representation of where society is going to? And do you see like, do you ever see a future scenario where instead of wanting to be more connected, we revert to have more nationalistic tendencies? Because when you were talking now about the Africa Union going towards this borderless continent and the creation of a common currency, et cetera, I think we kind of saw that already in Europe. That is what we've done in the past 70 years, but still we had Brexit in 2016, and we have these nationalist tendencies in France, in Italy. We started intervention talking about Salvini, but there are thousands of leaders in our societies here in Europe that actually want the destruction of Europe. They want to go back to what it was before, to these national borders. So yeah. I'm quite interested in understanding what is your assessment of these, and where do you think we're going to actually, despite these nationalistic tendencies?
So there's no question that a map of mega cities, or at least the depiction of cities as they actually geographically are in terms of their size, rather than just showing them as the little black dots all the same size, plus an overlay of physical connectivity across boundaries, plus an overlay of demographics, meaning where are the people. There's no question that combined, those layers, tell you a lot more about how the world works than a map that only shows you borders between countries and each country is a different color, like a jigsaw puzzle, right? There's no question, it's night and day, right? I mean, this is why I always say those political maps should not be in children's classrooms. They should not be in your offices. I think it's actually an intellectual crime. We raise our children to believe that political division is the natural state of affairs, and it's not. There's nothing natural or even human per se about it. It's purely political. So I insist that we, have maps that tell us how the world works. And that's what the maps you're describing and I'm describing, that's what they do. And there are so many examples of that. And in the TED Talk and others, I mentioned them. I mean, there are city economies that are much larger than national economies. There are city economies that are not political capitals, that are effectively regional economic centers and capitals, and so on and so on. There are cities that are much more connected to each other across boundaries than those cities are connected to other cities in their same country. So there are so many different filters and logics that demonstrate how much flow there is across borders, particularly between cities. And now that's not to say that it undermines the state. One of my central arguments is that a strong state is made up of strong cities. And the most powerful states of the past, present, and future will be those that harness the power of the maximum number of cities. So the United States has 40 major urban clusters. That's why the United States is the United States. That's why it's the richest, most powerful empire the world has ever known. 40, right? There's no other country even that comes even close. Only China today is in the process of designating about 24 mega city urban clusters. It has not yet completed the process of building all of these out, but it's well on its way. And that is why China is China. That is why China is the largest economy on the planet Earth today, with the most people and in many cases the best infrastructure as well. Not because of Beijing being a centralized political system, but because Beijing as a centralized political system enabled and created the conditions for 24 mega cities to become huge economic engines to make the Chinese state as rich and powerful as it is, right? So again, there's not a discrepancy between the city and the state. A state that acts against the interests of its cities will become a failed state. So Brexit is a great case in point, right? The people of London did not vote for Brexit, right? But other people did, and it wound up being 50% of the population. Very dumb move, right? You have to act as one team. The cities of a country must act as one team in order for the state to be great. Final point, just do a thought experiment. Name me a successful state that doesn't have any meaningful cities or that only has failed cities. You'll, of course, never come up with one. But you can think of many countries that have thriving cities where the state is a failure, right? And the city is the only thing keeping the state functioning at all. So always remember that for the last 7,000 years of history, it's the city that drives the state, not the state that drives the city. There's a reason why we've had cities for 7,000 years and states for only a couple of hundred years. And you and I, and certainly Maria, you're a sci-fi fan, we can posit many futures where we have no states, but we're always going to have the cities.
That's really interesting, actually, also because I guess this kind of leads me on to something that you said, I think also in one of your TED Talks, actually, about the importance of infrastructure in order to actually think of this future that is hyper-connected in a way. And I think actually you said something that I thought was super interesting, which was that you believe that governments should be paying 1 trillion in infrastructure for every 1 billion people. So I was just wondering, do you think that's also one of the reasons why China has managed to grow so quickly and might actually become a really, really important player in future politics, as it already is today, to be honest? And I guess connected to that question is, who do you see the main power players to be in, say, the next 100 years? And do you believe that energy as a currency will have to sort of play into who will actually be really, really important in the geopolitical sphere in, say, 50 to 100 years?
Well, infrastructure and energy have always been critical drivers of grand strategy of empires, right? The Roman Empire built roads, and it was the extension of the roads that allows us to know the full geographic extent of the Roman Empire. So roads were crucial. The Ottoman Empire and the British Empire and the Russian Empire built railways. And if it weren't for the construction of those railways, it would have been more difficult to subdue the geographies that they did, whether it's Africa, South Asia, or the Arabian Peninsula. So infrastructure has always been the critical, method by which empires expand. And that's why when I write about Belt and Road, and I started traveling in Central Asia almost, literally more than 20 years ago now. And when I wrote my first book, I spent a lot more time in Central Asia just looking at the pipeline project and the railway project. So it was energy, as you mentioned. It was also trade corridors and so forth. And I talked about how, in a way, infrastructure recodes the role of a country. When you take landlocked post-Soviet countries that have lost, that have gained an identity, but lost their economic orbit, they need connectivity to redefine who they are and what their role is in the global division of labor. And China came along and began to build those infrastructures. So part of China is a superpower today, not because of the number of nuclear weapons it has. If I ask any of the three of you, how many nuclear weapons does China have? I bet you don't know. And guess what? It doesn't matter. You don't need to care, right? It has enough. Even North Korea has enough because it has one, right? You only need one to have enough. So China is not a superpower because of its nuclear arsenal. It's a superpower because of its currency reserves, because of its trade surpluses, because it's the factory floor of the world, and because it's exporting infrastructure. And it has defined infrastructure as a global public good, and others have agreed with it. Italy joined the Belt and Road Initiative, right, against the wishes of your fellow European Union members. But you did so because you saw a common commercial interest in building trade corridors and so forth. And in a way, your port of Trieste, is part of the infrastructure arms race in the world, because the port deal between China and Trieste gained a lot of scrutiny and criticism. But then what happened? As you know, the ports of Hamburg and other European ports got together and said, let's buy the Trieste port so that the Chinese cannot buy it. So here you have it. The global infrastructure arms race is part of China's grand strategy, and it's part of Europe's grand strategy in response to China. And so that's why in Connectography, I talk about the infrastructure arms race, because that is, maybe 75% of geopolitics today. And the military stuff that's day to day is extremely important and decisive. But in terms of every single day, what's happening, it's more like 25%.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I know you have a hard stop in 2 minutes, so I think we'll try and wrap it up. But we tend to always finish these podcasts with the same question, which is, what is a book that you would recommend for COVID times? And the second part of this is, what is the book that changed your life?
Oh my goodness, a book that changed my life and a book for COVID times.
We always finish on an easy note, obviously.
Yeah. So, I've been fortunately reading a lot during COVID, which I think probably many, many people have. And a great book that I just read was actually about this sort of entire history of cities, but I'm trying to remember the name of the author. It's a British author. I have to find it. If I open my Kindle, maybe it'll pop up. Let me get it for you. This was, by the way, I was just reading Anthony Bourdain's travel book, which was also really good. It was published posthumously, but that didn't really change my life as much as I liked it. Let me think. When I was young, I used to read the plays of George Bernard Shaw. And so I would say all of George Bernard Shaw's plays really had a big impact on me. The Cities book is Metropolis by Ben Wilson, really one of the best books that I read, during the pandemic. It came out last year, so it's still very, very fresh. So I would recommend that. It's very hard to pinpoint one book kind of, if you go back, oh boy, that's going to be a really tough one. I'd have to break it down by genre. I'd have to give you one in the category of philosophy, one in history.
You can give us more than one. You can give us more than one. We like good book recommendations.
One in geopolitics. There's just no end. But okay, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna give you a shameless plug for my daughter's book. Because my daughter has published a book. It's on Amazon. It's called From Scotland to Singapore. And it's about our train journey all the way across Eurasia, literally from Inverness, Scotland, all the way to Singapore. It's the longest contiguous train trip that you can make in the whole world. You have to keep on changing trains, but they're the furthest two connected points on the planet Earth by infrastructure. So we did this in order to discover connectography in a way. But it's through the world through the eyes of an 11-year-old. So for those of you who are Generation Z or younger, this is the book for you.
And how long does the journey take? I'd be interested.
It's funny, you know, so it takes 14 hours to fly from Singapore to London / Scotland. And it takes about 14 weeks to make it back, roughly. Yeah. But I do want to, you know, give a shout out. I mean, you know, I take enormous amounts of, you know, footnotes and citations and long bibliographies of 20, 30 pages in my books. So feel free to reference those. Everything I reference is usually something I like. So I don't want to sell anyone short. Since you have the books, feel free to consider my bibliographies and endorsement.
And of course, Nico, we should also remind that there are other books that might have changed your life, which are the ones that you actually published. So once again, we have Movers now. I think it's the latest one. We have Connectography. Nico, can you show them? Let's do some. Yeah, yes, perfect.
So, I have them all in Italian, but you know, this is Move.
I really like the cover. It's a very nice cover.
Yeah, I love it, actually. This is us, probably.
Yeah,
then there's
right.
the one before this that I actually have home. It's I don't know the English title. In Italian, it's Il secolo asiatico.
The future is Asian, right?
Yeah, the future is Asian, which is it's super enlightening. And then there's a Connectography. These are actually super good books for the summer because, you know what, you have plenty of material for thought. Even though I actually love them because, you know, once you start them, then it takes 2 days to finish them because you get so into the text that it's difficult to not to read them in just 2 days.
Well, I'm glad you enjoy, and I'll just say as a final thought, you know, it was a real pleasure to write the section on Italy for this new book because, you know, I think a lot of people are very dismissive of Europe in general and Italy as well within that context in terms of the role of the region in the future. But as you know, I come out quite positive about this Padania region of northern Italy and Europe as a whole when you take into account the trends like climate change and social policy and the capacity, even if you have not yet implemented it, the capacity to absorb and assimilate migrants. And that really is the political test for your generation, you know, and I still am quite optimistic about it. So good luck to all of you, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being with us. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely.
Okay, take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Hope we'll have you again in the future.
Bye.
So let's wrap up, guys.
That was super interesting. Super interesting.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I feel like geopolitics seems to be a trend because it's been a trend probably for a while, right? I'm just late to the party. But there's been a lot of books coming out on this. So literally, I read in the last couple of weeks, I read 2 on geopolitics, the power of geography. Like, it's really, really interesting how I think people are starting to think about it a bit more.
Just 2 books in 2 weeks, it's below your average.
Yeah,
I'm quite shocked.
Exactly. I feel like for the next live, hopefully, if Mr. Khanna comes back, I feel like we should focus on sci-fi. Yeah. We touched on it for like a second, but I feel like I can sense he's a sci-fi geek.
Yeah, it's like you basically. So you have to lead the conversation on that because I'm not an expert on sci-fi. I'm actually not a huge fan of sci-fi either, but that's fine.
Travesty.
So wrapping up, what's next on our agenda? What's coming up in the next couple of weeks, guys? Do you know? Because I honestly don't have the calendar in front of me, so I have no idea who's coming in the next couple of lives.
I feel like let's keep it under wraps because there's a lot going on, and I also don't have the calendar, so I'm just shamelessly trying to skirt this question.
Yeah.
But I think there's lots happening, so stay tuned, and obviously we will post it on all of our social media pages.
Yeah, in fact, maybe that's what we can say in the meanwhile. If you really want to know who's coming up in the next couple of weeks, so featuring in our podcast, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn,
YouTube.
Share us. YouTube, Apple Podcast, Spotify. You can always find our previous episodes. Most of them are in Italian, but we're going on with this English internationalization of our podcast. So I'm sure more will come up with non-Italian guests.
Let us know if you like this format, if you appreciate even our English episodes, so that we can understand if we should bring them forward or not.
Exactly.
All right. And this being said, I wish you all a lovely weekend. And yeah, I don't know. I'm in Brussels. It's raining, but if it's May and it's spring in other places and it's sunny outside, go out and enjoy the sun.
It's raining. It's raining here as well.
Then
Yes,
we're just unlucky.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks for being with us as usual. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, everyone.